Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Dr. David Sable, Director of Healthcare and Life Sciences Investing for the Special Situation Fund.
Right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled you're back with us after 1 week off for our NewYorkBIO annual meeting. Special thanks, obviously, to our sponsors of our annual meeting, as well as those of you who attended. For those of you who were registered attendees, you should have received an email this morning with a survey about the meeting, but more importantly, the link which you can use to access replays of all of the meeting panels and discussions, and that will be up for you for 30 days. So that's part of your registration. As we move into fall, we're going to continue with our virtual breakfast series, and later this fall, we'll be hosting the Emerging Biotech Company Showcase in partnership with the New York Stock Exchange. But before then, we have an amazing guest today in David Sable, and I'm going to kick it over to Derek to introduce him so we can have a fun conversation.
Okay, David, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You are almost difficult to characterize because you fill the roles of physician, entrepreneur, investor, and amazing writer, incredibly. So we tend to kick off with a bit of an origin story. So do you want to walk us through a little bit of how you ended up where you are?
Sure, happy to. Thank you. And thank you to NewYorkBIO for having me as a guest. I really appreciate it. My own path is, I would love to be able to say that I mapped all this out, that I had a grand master plan, that, it's like kind of like the movie scene where the kid's in high school and he just says, okay, this is where, and then they morph over to, this, whatever the destination was. In reality, I, earnestly went off as an accounting major to the University of Pennsylvania, knowing almost nothing about the University of Pennsylvania and even less about accounting. Kind of meandered through undergraduate school, and at the end of third year, I was ready to graduate. And the last thing I wanted to do was graduate. And Wharton is, it's a good undergraduate school. I got a good education, liked what I did. Nothing really caught my fancy. By the end of 3 years, I still didn't know what an investment banker was. I figured, I'm about to graduate from this pretty good school. Why don't I take some sciences? Because I hadn't taken any. So I took the pre-med course all at once as a senior, which is less hard than you think, because these are all freshman courses. Because I decided that, again, not because I really knew what it was, but I wanted to be a med student. So I applied to med school, got into it. It just seemed like a great thing to do. And back when I was in school, like now it's all startup culture and tech. This was way, way back. If you either were pre-med, you were pre-law, or there wasn't that many choices. So I got into a couple of med schools, loved medical school. Just the concept of building a foundation on basic science, layering an applied science on top of it, which is medicine. And then all the other areas of intersection of human interaction, as well as how dynamic medicine was. Even back then, you were starting to see the beginnings of a kind of analog, pattern-based discipline starting to turn digital. So it seemed like a really cool thing to do. And at about the same time, IVF was invented. And so it's like, just, to me, this seemed like revolutionary. And where did I hear about IVF? Of course, in a business class. I was in a healthcare finance class, and somebody mentioned, this thing where they take the eggs and the sperm and they put the embryo back and they make babies. It was like, wait a second. They woke me up out of the lecture. It's like, run back the tape on that.
Yeah.
So it's like,
I'm sorry, what?
Exactly. So that kind of, I said, okay, let's put a pin in that one. So, went to med school, got to med school, kind of was drawn into obstetrics and gynecology because at the time it was this kind of neat merger of a specialty with general practice.
Yeah.
In a way, it's like, most women, their GP is an OBGYN. On the same hand, you got to do things like major open surgery, which, I love surgery. It's very meditative, and you had all this neat stuff going on. So I did that over here in New York Hospital Cornell. And at the time, they had probably the best IVF center in the world. They brought in a guy named Zev Rosenwax from Virginia. They brought in a guy named Jacques Cohen as the head embryologist scientist, who was originally part of Steptoe and Edwards' original IVF team. And they were doing really, really neat stuff. So, managed to get a fellowship. I went up to Boston to do a fellowship at Brigham and Women's. And I figured, okay, I'm set. This is my path. I'm going to, kind of a academic bent medicine. I liked clinical medicine. I wanted to see patients more than I wanted to spend time in the lab. But coming out of fellowship, I was offered the opportunity to be part of a startup reproductive endocrine program at St. Barnabas Hospital in New Jersey, which had personal history to me because when I was 8 years old, that's where I had my tonsils out. And, unbeknownst to me, in my meanderings from Penn to New York Hospital to the Brigham, St. Barnabas had one of the best OBGYN departments in the country. There's an absolutely legendary doctor there named Jim Breen, who was president of ACOG, and he was the doctor who operated on Mamie Eisenhower. He's just an incredible leader, had built this huge department. He said, come on down, we can start your own program. It's like, well, that sounded amazing. So with a few other partners, we started an IVF program at St. Barnabas in the mid-90s. And that, interestingly, has spun out a whole bunch of great programs. One of the biggest IVF programs in the world, it's called RMA New Jersey. It's now IVI RMA, which emerged from this huge Spanish program, spun out of the St. Barnabas program. These were my ex-partners. They did a fabulous job. I would have done a great thing if I'd followed them, but of course I didn't. But so they deserve a lot of credit. We did start the first embryo diagnosis company, something called Reprogenetics. I was a co-founder of that, spun out of that. So terrific IVF program, now run by an absolute dynamo of a doctor named Serena Chen, who I brought in to work with us. So that was great. So kind of suffering from career attention deficit disorder in 1998, I said, I want to start my own IVF program. So I went back to New York and rented out the old New York City Fencing Club at 71st and Broadway. They gutted it, built this beautiful little IVF hospital there, operated it as kind of a one-person practice for the better part of a year. And at that point, that's when the St. Barnabas people left to form RMA. And St. Barnabas called me up and said, you think about coming back here and working? Because they didn't know where to go. And being the budding business person, I said, aha, this is leverage. I can negotiate something pretty well here. So long and short of it, I sold my program in New York to St. Barnabas, went back there, ran that for 4 years.
Oh, okay.
So it's like, all right, I'm a practicing doctor. This is kind of a very relatively linear career path with a couple of nice little offshoots. Around 2004, I realized, and this is something that a lot of people in biotech have told me, they've seen the same thing. I woke up, I had a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they didn't know who their father was. We were living in New York. I was spending an hour and a half a day commuting to New Jersey. And I said, I'm going to take a year off. I'm going to, we had sold the first practice. We took St. Barnabas private. I said, I'm going to take a sabbatical, make breakfast for the kids, walk them to preschool, that kind of thing. And so I take the year sabbatical. Of course, that year sabbatical is now in its 16th year. This is where the random walk career model starts coming into play. I had a couple of consulting gigs, one at Deutsche Bank and then another doing some work for a big hedge fund called the St. Barnabas Group. Morphed into launching a life sciences fund. And I've been at that. That fund is now 15 years old. Kind of along the way, as Derek kindly mentioned, I got the opportunity to start writing. I started teaching entrepreneurship at Columbia in 2012. I was asked to join the board of directors of the patient advocacy group Resolve, which is really a fabulous IVF patient group, in 2012. And when I did that, I said, okay, if I'm going to do this, I got to go back and study the industry again, because by that point I'd been out of the industry for 7 years. And that was very eye-opening. It's like you look at the industry from a completely different vantage point from when you're on the front line seeing patients. And I said, boy, there's an awful lot of cool innovation that's been happening in other industries that's not happening in IVF. And that starts the wheels turning. So I started doing some entrepreneurial things there. We launched a venture fund dedicated just to IVF. We started sitting on a few boards. And just last week, we announced a kind of a neat new entity called IVF Open, which is one of the things we're doing in IVF. So it's like, I kind of managed to keep my time filled and, start, it's, if you ever read the book, Prayer for Owen Meany by, no, it's not, I'm sorry, Cider House Rules by John Irving. The main character keeps saying, the purpose in life is just to be of use. So I'm just trying to be of use. I know. Justify the fact that I'm taking up space.
I think you're probably you're probably a little too modest in this respect, right? Because if half the time, I remember seeing virtually any company or anything of interest that had a cool headline in IVF or fertility or even women's health, I would more or less scan down the list, and special situations one would be on it, right? If you weren't second under the headline, you were usually somewhere in the top 5. So,
well, Derek, that's the advantage of being the one writing the articles.
No, these were generic press releases. Is that the key? That's also a good gig if you could start companies and then you be the person writing about the companies that you start and have people get some separation between them. I don't know that anybody's necessarily conquered that one, but so why don't we talk a little bit about tomorrow and about IVF Open, and we can set the stage a little bit. You can talk a little bit about really kind of what they do, because we'll get to where they came from in a minute. I had read there was a release on IVF Open the other day that basically set up the challenge of there are, Jessica Smith is the most common name in the country, or was the most common name in the country on year X. And, if we play out the statistics, there's going to be something like 10,000 Jessica Smiths, that go in for IVF in a given year. And, there is some chance of, kind of crosstalk or anything like that between all of their samples, which anyone that followed Twitter this morning, I posted a GIF of the Agent Smith from The Matrix. They're all the same, and how could you possibly mix them up if you're thinking about fertility? So can you talk a little bit about where IVF Open came from and what kind of things that you're thinking about building there?
Sure, no, happy to. First thing I do is I do want to separate, you mentioned Tomorrow, which I think is reference to Tomorrow Life Sciences, which is one of the companies that's coming in as part of the industry consortium that we're putting together. But they're separate from IVF Open. But the cool thing about IVF Open is that it's trying to build a kind of a foundational step towards rectifying some of the outgrowths of, sort of the growing pains of the IVF industry. It's like it seems ironic to be talking about growing pains 40 years in. They're now IVF babies that are having, they're almost the age where they can have grandchildren. It's really, the industry has grown a lot. But on the same hand, it's grown in a way that, in ways we didn't foresee, and created problems we didn't know we're going to create. When we first started doing IVF, we had eggs, embryos, eggs, sperm, and embryos, and everything was used up by the end of the cycle. So nothing was saved.
Oh, right.
We didn't know how to freeze embryos in the beginning. Yeah. And frankly, the pregnancy rate per embryo we put back was so low that we put back almost everything that was viable in the beginning. Right. So if you remember, you turn the clock back 20 years, 30 years, we had terrible pregnancy rates and high triplets rates. Not a good combination. But it's the best we could do. It was still great science and good medicine for the level of technology. Yeah. You start fast forwarding through the decades, and we started checking off the things that we could do. We learned how to freeze embryos. So at that point, it was rare we'd put back more than 3 or 4 per cycle. Still too many. And if we made 5 or 6 or 8, then we could freeze them and save them for subsequent cycles, which was great. And go through the 90s into the 2000s, the implantation rate per embryo started going higher and higher. So instead of putting back 3 or 4, we're putting back 1 or 2 or 3, which means more embryos to freeze. And then the big thing happened this century when we kind of cracked the code on freezing eggs. which is great because you could, you have someone who's about to go through cancer surgery, or for whatever reason, you want to proactively manage your fertility life cycle. You could stimulate the ovaries, get a cohort of eggs, freeze them, and you're set for 25 years. Those eggs will remain frozen in time in terms of their fertility potential. So now we're freezing lots of embryos, we're freezing lots of eggs. We've always been freezing sperm samples. We've been biopsying embryos to check for genetic aspects of them, yet another sample to freeze. We do testicular biopsies for really severe male factor, more samples to freeze. Ovarian biopsies will be happening. Ultimately, we'll be making eggs out of stem cells, all of which are going to be frozen. So the problem is the labs just kind of weren't built to do industrial level freezing, maintenance, quality control, and storage. So that kind of crept up on that. And as you saw in the past few years, we've had a few lab failures. And this is catastrophic. This is not, for example, you talked about somebody having their eggs frozen before they go through cancer treatment. That's their whole family. The whole future family is there. This is really catastrophic. So these are what should be never errors. We talk about never errors in medicine. This is like operating on the wrong side of the brain. These things should never happen. So your average IVF lab still doesn't have an optimal system for tracking all these specimens. In the beginning, it was a tank with, you pour the liquid nitrogen into it. You got a clipboard and a pencil, and you've got yellow stickies, and the yellow stickies have the name of the patient, maybe her birth date, or maybe her social security number. And you put the sticky, stick it around the little straw, and that's fine if you've got a few dozen samples. We now have hundreds of thousands and millions of samples worldwide. Right. And worse, IVF is growing. The number of freezing samples is growing. So we've really got to get a handle on this. So you mentioned Tomorrow Life Sciences, and this is a company that has built a really beautiful robotic, high impact, highly efficient digital supply chain cryo system. And parenthetically, and I'm not here to talk my book, but this was the first investment the venture fund made. Good operators, great thing, but we're not here to talk about that. What that kind of capability lends itself to, though, is really bringing the supply and custody chain of eggs, embryos, sperm from the point of formation all the way through their lifespan as entities, whether they're transferred, used, transferred to another facility, as they're tested, as the eggs are fertilized, developed, then refrozen as embryos. And what we need for these literally millions of samples is unique identifiers. Yes. Everything needs its own number. There are lots of cases in the press of a woman or a couple having a baby that was not intended for them. The wrong embryo was placed in, or the embryo was placed in a misidentified patient. And there, it's like, everybody loses. The poor baby, it's like, it's a football with two sets of parents. And obviously the legal ramifications are obvious, but even worse, this is just bad medicine. This is just, this is a system that should never happen. So David, I'm sorry.
How often and you're just getting me thinking, how often are samples moved from lab to lab? If let's say I live in New York now and I'm undergoing treatment and then I move to LA, do you ship across the country? How does that work for people?
If you have your eggs retrieved one place and you want to use them somewhere else, you can keep them in the place that they were retrieved. You can move them to a central storage facility. Okay. Or you could move them to the place you're moving to for when you ultimately will use them. Okay. Now, it's a very fluid thing, and I've spoken to lab directors who say a third of the frozen samples in their lab came from somewhere else. Okay, so there are others where they never do move, but there is an awful lot of movement.
Okay, so that can create an additional layer of complexity. It's not just your own patient base, which who they are and you have their entire medical records there.
Exactly.
And And do you, as the patient, control where they're stored when they move, that
Yes.
kind of thing? Do you kind of control their destiny? Okay.
Yeah, you control it.
So that,
Now, that doesn't mean that the center can't make it difficult to move them. I haven't seen that, but you hear anecdotal reports that, but no, it's absolutely, those specimens are yours, and you should be able to move them anywhere you want. But
Yeah.
even if you're moving them from a place that has a incredibly good and efficient engineered identification system, you may move them to somewhere else that doesn't have that.
Right.
Or you may move them to somewhere else where, there's someone with the same name, the Jessica Smith. It's like in the 1990s, 1.6% of all women in the United States were named Jessica. And 0.1% of all last names is Smith. So you get to you start getting to lots and lots of Jessica Smiths presenting for, I think I came up with 675, representing 8,100 samples, each one of those samples having dozens of identity checks. So you've got literally tens of thousands of potential identity check mistakes just from people named Jessica Smith.
Right.
So
just kind of throwing the Jennifers out there.
That's right. It's Jennifer is, I think, the
Smith
number 5 or 6. So it becomes a problem pretty quickly. So it's so all IVF Open's doing, they're just going to become a number or an identifier generator. This is a nonprofit. This is one place generating all the numbers. Kind of a foundational technology that we think is going to, it's in terms of risk mitigation, it's huge. In terms of being one of the steps we have into turning the IVF industry into a digitally functioning, industry with a real 21st century supply chain, you can make the argument that it's absolutely necessary to have this step as well as a bunch of others. And this one is like, all right, well, it's a nonprofit way. Let's just do it, generate the numbers. Anyone who's operating somewhere in that patient supply chain can use this system, whether it comes off of a cell phone or whatever. It's like, I know it's like with Microsoft, if I want to log into a certain thing, there's an authenticator app on my phone that just keeps generating numbers. Here we're working with IBM because IBM is probably the expert in these large supply chain management systems. They've done it with food, they've done it with pharmaceuticals, and in our work with them, it's like they just kind of blow you away. It's like being a person off the street suddenly working with NASA. It's like whoa.
Awesome. Woo! This reminds me of, I led Merck's efforts to pass federal legislation for track and trace of pharmaceuticals. And so this sounds similar in concept, even if the execution is different, but very similar to that.
Yeah, it's the same kind of concept. We're just trying to have this one, it's like kind of a universal source of truth for who the specimen belongs to. And it's just a kind of a good for everybody.
There's a parallel here for patient information infrastructure, right? If you can do this with samples like these, you can very easily take the steps to get to the point where patients own their health records, and those records can be moved, and they can be moved safely and securely. There are not too many steps to think of this as an infrastructure problem across the entire system. Solving things one step at a time. I don't know if IVF Open has any dreams of doing that, but if you think about things as structural challenges, you've taken one facet where that's kind of the big problem, and provided what looks like a really good system to move things.
Well, I've got it. Yeah, it's you're kind to imply the kind of ambitions to us. My job as co-chair with Susan Molinari is to keep our ambitions humble. I want this. I want to be a number generator. Let's solve this problem. Granted, it's late night. You kind of open and stare at the ceiling and think, "Oh, the great ways this could reverberate." But let's solve this particular problem in a really focused way. Let's be engineers and not not novelists for the moment. And then it's like I would love to see it reverberate in ways that are helpful to everybody. But if we do nothing other than generate a reliable, accurate, universally used, source of identifiers, then home run. We can stop there, go fishing, and it's like that's that. But
there is a question from the audience on the sort of how, right? It says,
Yeah.
are you using blockchain with these unique numbers of IVF open? From David K.
Yeah, it is being engineered using IBM's blockchain group. Yeah, I'm reluctant to use terms that I'm not very good at defining and discussing in a technical sense. And it seems that over the years, or not so many years, but over the past few years, I've heard people use the word blockchain in ways that implies very broad and imprecise definitions. But yeah, it is coming out of IBM's blockchain group, and the technical aspects I will drop out of those conversations very, very early, because I pretend to be a data guy. I'm not a data guy.
The more you wave your hands when using the word blockchain, the less it is actually applicable to whatever it is you're doing. The louder and the more caps lock that you use,
the vision thing.
Really, yeah, exactly. The less practical it becomes. You know, it's funny because I was saying to you earlier in reading through this, you know, the blockchain is buried about halfway down in the press release. I start to read through it. I'm like, you know, it seems like a really good application for blockchain in healthcare. And by the middle of the thing, you're like, oh yes, there you go. Excellent. We got there.
Yeah. Derek, I've got to interject there for a second, just so it doesn't seem like I'm being dishonest or disingenuous. It actually wasn't a press release because I wrote it. And it's one of those little articles that Forbes lets me put in. If we call it a press release, that implies a degree of authority and vetting and editing greater than it actually had. So I don't want to overstate it as a reference point.
We're going to come back to it. We're going to come back to this in a little while, but I'm not going to let you get away with too much modesty on behalf of your writing portfolio. I'll send out some links later. It's truly an amazing, you know, gift that you have on that one. But for where we are now, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about teaching entrepreneurship and the course that you do at Columbia Business School. You know, it's something that you tweet about a lot. You bring a lot from your lectures out into the public domain. And you know, just as a kickoff, can you give people a little bit of background on what the course is, and a little bit of what you try and bring into it at Columbia?
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. I talked for about 4 or 5 years with the people that run the healthcare program at the Columbia Business School about teaching, you know, the intersection of science and business. And it was like one of those things is kind of the movie Groundhog Day. We'd have the same conversation every 6 months as if we've never had it before.
Yeah.
And nothing ever happened. And while I was doing this, I was giving a series of lectures in the biotechnology section of the biology department. And I mentioned it to a woman named Carol Lynn, who was the professor that ran that program back then. It's since been taken over by Lily Yamasaki, who does a great job on it. And I mentioned that, you know, it's like, I was trying to organize this course, and she says, oh, you want to teach a course? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, show me an outline. So I gave her my course outline. A week later, I get a call from the Dean of Students at the Graduate School of Arts and Science. He says, you're a teacher. Come September, you're teaching. So, the business school is lost. Yeah, but it's a course designed only for scientists and engineers. And I do let liberal arts students in. As part of my revenge against Columbia Business School, no business students are allowed. To be honest, I think it's a little too rudimentary on the business side and a little too heavy on the science side. Yeah. So it's by permission only. This is a course I want people to be serious about. And it's really for upper level undergrads and grad students that have a technical background, really know how to do something. They've got calluses on their hands, dirt underneath their fingernails. They burn themselves in an electrical engineering lab. They've smelled the wrong reagents being created in the lab and said, oh boy, no, that's, you know, when the sulfur comes out of the petri dish. So but they don't know how to take a good idea to tangible activity in the marketplace. And my job is to draw that map for them. So this is a course where they have to apply to get in. It's by permission only. And it's in any given year, maybe a third of the people that apply get in. The course has been 7 students at one point. It's also been as high as 450. And it really, it's
that's a pretty big disparity. That's a big swing.
Put it this way, the semester that it was 7 was the semester after it was 400. So
Oh, okay.
the 400 was my stadium tour. The 7 was playing a club. But I experimented with it. The classroom is a laboratory, and we're trying to
Yes.
just give them the ability. If they've got a great idea, I want them to know that they can take that idea to the marketplace, or at least they know how to do it. They can choose where in that journey they
Mhm.
want to get in and get off, instead of thinking, okay, well, now it's a business, now I have to hand it over to somebody else.
Right.
So we talk about the business formation from literally from the idea, from the idea of an idea.
Mhm.
Say, okay, what do you do with it? You decide, okay, I'm going to make this to a company. The preamble to the course is, okay, I've told everybody, I've quit my job, I've turned down the acceptance to, Columbia PNS, or I've turned down my job at, McKinsey or with Merck or whomever, and I'm going to start this business. Okay, day one of the class is, okay, what do I do when I wake up that day? And we
Right.
walk you through the steps of forming your plan to be an entrepreneur,
Mhm.
carrying out the idea of being an entrepreneur, going from 1 person to 2 people, which is key,
Right.
to 10 people, getting your first funding, starting your IP strategy, which you should start on day 1, deciding where your market positioning is, deciding when idea is better as an idea than it is as something to do. And it's just a blast. And it's more entrepreneurship than it is biotech, but we use biotechnology as the scaffolding to build everything, because I tell the students, biotechnology is entrepreneurship on steroids.
Mhm.
Mhm.
If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere.
Yeah.
You've got the longest product development cycle in all of business. You've got an accelerating need for funding. You've got the longest period of a lack of financial metrics by which to hang valuation on, which therefore makes it just unbelievably difficult to attract rational thinking investors and
Mhm.
coworkers and things like that. So every challenge within entrepreneurship is in biotechnology. And boy, the students blow me away every year. It's just a phenomenal group. I've been doing it since 2011. I teach every second or third semester.
Mhm.
The woman heading up COVID response for the Gates Foundation now
Mhm.
is one of my students. I've had Forbes 30 under 30
Wow.
students. I go to JP Morgan, and I've got my ex-students stopping me in the hallway, now working at very high levels for phenomenal companies.
Yeah.
It's just, some people play golf, some people do things as they, this is my,
This is your thing.
this is
This
my
is your
thing.
thing,
It's just a joy. And
Well, and also,
would-
don't you think that even if they don't walk out of your class and found a company, that when they're ready, if they have that mindset already, they also know not only how to do it, but where to find the answers when the time comes, and how to find their path later.
Exactly.
That's a gift.
It's like, I just don't want them to think that they are helpless, or that their idea has to die with them, or they have to give it to somebody else.
Yeah.
So it's a nice kind of an empowering thing. It's a course that we can be creative. And since it's a business course in the biology department, I can do whatever I want.
So what are the splits on where your students tend to end up? Right? Is it pretty broad? How many people? I would imagine that the number of people that come into your course with a singular idea and leave your course going to pursue that exact idea is probably really, really low, right? Because the hit rate on ideas that are actually viable in biotech is actually vanishingly small.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly true. Now, I guess like a lot of good or interesting career paths, a lot of your ideas become the kindling for what ultimately turns into something that's good. It's like you're along. The one thing I've noticed about my students is almost to a T is, despite the fact they're incredibly smart, incredibly creative, and really hardworking, they cling to that undergraduate or early grad school vision that your work life is going to be very linear.
Yeah.
You're going to follow one path, and that will take you somewhere else. That will take you somewhere else. And, the reality, as we all know, is that it tends to be more Brownian motion than it is linear. And sometimes it's like a fifth dimension Brownian motion. So at least it gives them something to hearken back to.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty strict about giving them, yes, your career is completely nonlinear, but you need certain scripts, for want of a better term,
Yes.
to plug in to that linearity. Like I tell them, I say, early on in the cycle, there's the 5 things that you should have going through your mind all the time. It's like, how am I communicating? What's my funding situation? Where am I on proof of concept? Where am I on mapping out my value inflections? That type of thing. And just to give them something to fall back on when they're kind of, when the whole world just seems like a mess. And so we kind of go these little plug and play aspects of running your organization, just to keep things in context. And within that, like, okay, let your creativity just flow. And we do stress to them that the basic idea, the starting idea is not cast in stone. It's more like one of those things that blows away with the wind, but the wind then clarifies where you should be going. And and these are things you're going to learn, and you're going to base what you do in the future. And in a lot of cases, I tell them to keep challenging themselves, because a lot of their ideas are value traps. It's like that initial idea, if you cling too tightly to it, it's going to keep you from seeing where you should be going, just because you're wed in an almost religious sense to that initial idea. You fall in love with it. So we kind of talk them out of it.
Yeah. You can be a zealot, which leads you to nowhere.
Yes. Yeah, we beat each other up in class about that all the time. They spend a lot of time politely knocking each other down.
Yeah.
Well, you also tend to have a pretty broad, I would say, real world aspect to what you're talking about. Your reading list changes every year. Your guest speakers tend to change every year, and you tend to bring in people that have been there and done that. Usually people that have been there and done that on the very recent stage, which is also a great crucible for understanding that ideas change, people change, and things tend to not work out the way that you thought they would in the beginning.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought the guest speaker part of the class, because frankly, that's the valuable part of the class. The students, it's almost like they pay a toll the first hour having to listen to me talk. And then I bring somebody like, Luke Timmerman or Jacques Cohen or Josh Brown or Heidi Moore, someone who just like spans their minds and maps out a phenomenal story. And I tell them, these people come in, they say, oh, well, what should my slide deck be? I say, your slide deck shouldn't be. I want you to come in and tell me, just walk me through how you got from sitting in a classroom like this to where you are now.
Yeah.
And the stories are phenomenal. It's like, so we bring in, I think we bring in CEOs and VCs and people like that, but we bring in, journalists and writers and, obviously entrepreneurs and things of that sort. Anybody with a really great story to tell. And the stories are like, they're so uplifting. You look at, I mentioned him because he made such a phenomenal impression on the class. You look at Josh Brown, who's now on CNBC, and he's all over the place. But he's written 2 books. He knows nothing about biotechnology, admittedly, but he knows something about everything else. He started out wanting to be an artist, and he is a phenomenally talented cartoonist. And he told the story of, he's at University of Maryland, which is apparently the place for that. Who knew? And while he was an undergraduate, the movie Toy Story was released with computer generating drawing, and he just saw his dream go up in smoke. And he said, okay, my life is over. I'm a loser. It's like, forget it. And he just tells the story of this building this phenomenal career on top of that.
Yeah.
And it's like, and the students just, they leave so energized by that. And frankly, so do I. I love hearing that kind of thing. And we have 11 or 12 speakers a semester. So it's just, that in and by itself is worth the price of admission. So they have to put up with me for the hour before that. But it's just an amazing thing for them to be exposed to.
We have we have a good question. Lauren Busby says, are students always working on their own projects, or do they work on a budding project of the university? Also, how do you teach them about failure?
Okay, the great questions. First is the project that they have to have in their mind, and they need to spell out that project for me when they apply to be in the class, is
Okay.
just an intellectual construct for their own use.
Yeah.
Just so that as we talk about, okay, putting together your value inflection strategy, putting together your first proof of concept that you're going to go out and do your first fundraise on the basis of, as you go from idea to reality, I want them to think about, okay, how do they use their idea? If I've got 400 people in the class, I'm not going to be vetting each idea,
Yeah.
but in any
Right.
given day, 10 of them will be in front of the class pitching it.
Right.
And I tell them on a different day, I say, okay, today is grandmother day. You're pitching to your grandmother. And they all pitch. And we as fellow parts of the class will give grandmother level questions. The next week, I say, you are now pitching to the most misanthropic venture capitalist in the world. This person hates their life, they hate you, and they want to see you fail. So the level of our questioning is going to be along that line. Now, we're going to try to be polite, but we're going to pick up any inconsistency in your presentation. And I tell them, I say, any number that you present, you need to be able to derive for me on the spot. It's like when in my article,
Right.
Derek mentioned the number of Jessica Smiths. I went to census level data to derive that.
Yeah.
Census level data, then I went to the CIA website for population data, and we derived specific numbers. You need to be able on the spot to be able to derive all the numbers, or your credibility is out the window.
Yeah.
Half of your early presentations are not your idea, they are your credibility as an entrepreneur. So that's the kind of stuff we do. Meantime, I've forgotten the question that I'm answering. If you could repeat it.
So the project and then failure. How do you talk about failure? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Failure is, I tell them that from day one, we go by a mantra of there is no success, succeeding or failing. There's just doing.
Okay.
That it's kind of this Yoda-esque way of approaching it, because you can't go into entrepreneurship because you want to succeed in your project. You have to go into entrepreneurship because you love the process of being an entrepreneur.
Right.
And along the way, what succeeds and fails, you're going to have daily successes and failures. Personally, I've had two meaningful jobs in my life. One is I run funds that have to generate returns, and my public fund, every day I'm up 1%, I'm down 1%. You get numbers back. More importantly, I ran IVF programs, and you have 10 people come to you and say, okay, we are putting our faith in you to have a family and have children, have healthy children.
Yeah.
And at the end of a given day, I'd have 10 pregnancy tests, and it's not the 9 that were positive. It was the 1 that was negative that would keep me staring at the ceiling every night.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to internalize in a positive, energizing way what works and what doesn't, learn from what doesn't work. If you say, okay, this is a marathon, I'm going to hit a tape at the end, and that will define whether I've been a success or failure, well, forget it. You're not going to be able to run those 26 miles if the whole validation of what you've done is what the numbers show when you hit the tape.
Yeah.
Every day you got to keep yourself going. So I tell them day one, say, take the success failure thing, just take it out of your mind. I don't want to hear about that. And similarly, I tell them, I say, you don't have a college major here. Define yourself as a problem solver. And as one problem gets solved, immediately be thinking about the next one. Because even if your wildest success happens, you're going to wake up the next day, it's like having a good meal. You're going to wake up the next day hungry. So the whole success failure binary, it's something we just reject, that whole concept.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about how, now that all learning is remote, right? Can we talk a little bit about that, how that's impacted, the way that you communicate with your students, and really what you think about, when you think about the future here? How much of the remote learning, especially for courses like this, do you think sticks?
I guess it depends on how good an instructor you are. I taught last semester, and we were in person till March, then we were remote the rest of the time. I'm not teaching this semester. And I'll be happy to say it, I was a lousy remote teacher. I just didn't quite get the rhythm of it. Like when I teach, I wander around the podium and I go up and down the aisles, and I put my hand on the chair back of the student to wake him or her up, and and it's you get a feedback from the students, and you just see where the attention's lagging and frankly, when you're being boring, they kind of, you can see it. And so there's this feedback, there's this dynamic process. There's a real ecosystem. Remote, you just don't get that, and it really sucks. Now, I'm sure there are probably people that are really good at it. I wasn't. That said, it's a lot better than not doing it.
Correct.
And, I think that for people that don't have access or couldn't otherwise be in the classroom,
Right.
I think it's so much better. So it's a B+ instead of an A. Or in my hand, it was a B- instead of an A, but it's still doable. That said, the ideal for education should be in person. Now, if you want to learn finance, like when I was trying to do a deep dive into learning portfolio management, Aswath Damodaran, the chairman of finance at NYU, every one of his courses is online. Right. And boy, did I drink it that well often. It's an open source, piece of, it's available. And similarly, like all these amazing courses are online for free. That's invaluable. But as far as the ideal for what undergraduate and graduate education should be, I think it should be in person to the extent that it can.
Yeah, I think we're entering an interesting blend where, like you said, there's a ton of content online, and there's certain things that are probably learned just fine viewing online lectures, and there are other things where the in-person thing really counts. And the thing that's really difficult is you don't know who or how a particular student is going to react to you in person, or what kind of the spark is to make them think or to actually get them engaged in the class. And I would say online, that's exceptionally difficult. In person, it's probably still difficult, but accounting for how different people learn and how different people really get energized by things is a tough mountain to climb. We had another good question here. I'll let you answer. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, like, hats off to teachers in general. It's like I'm okay at it. I do, but people I've seen people that dedicate their life to just teaching, which they are the standard that we all really try to match. It's a phenomenal talent to take that picture in your brain and look at it 100 people, and they've got the same picture in theirs, and that's an amazing thing that online just doesn't quite do it.
No, I feel pretty similarly. So we had another good question. If we switch back to the IVF industry, how has COVID impacted IVF?
It's impacted in a bunch of ways. It essentially turned the industry switch off for about a quarter. Okay. When we were going through it's amazing how much was in the swirl of the unknown in March, April, and May.
Yeah.
Like I was in New York the entire time, and it's like constant cacophony of ambulance sirens. But if you recall, we didn't know how communicable the disease was in a practical sense. We didn't know the extent to which we needed to triage our medical equipment in people that would otherwise be used in a setting like IVF. Now, I think that IVF and helping people have families and using IVF to prevent disease and things like that is an incredible use of basic resources in our healthcare system and in the world overall. However, there are times when we need to take some of those resources and triage them elsewhere. So there was a while we thought, boy, just to use someone for doing sedation for an egg retrieval, we may need that person for doing intubations on an acute ward, or even a cafeteria that was converted to a ward. So we, as an industry, kind of erred on the side of dialing down our own activity to let those resources be used elsewhere. Now, I think it was a rational decision. It was a good decision. It turned out that, it may have been a little bit, we may have been too conservative, too cautious, but so be it. That's okay. Of course, our patients, and I still consider I'm not seeing patients, but I still consider them that way. Our patients, they wanted to catch up right away. And with fertility issues, obviously the clock is ticking.
Right.
The can't tell someone, say, oh, we cycle for a year. It's like with each successive month, there is a small incremental decrease in ovarian reserve and things of that sort. So, what the industry has done is now the industry is trying to catch up. So I think you're seeing a compensating bump up in volume. Overall, in terms of the operations aspect of IVF, not much of a change. Yeah, we do have places where people are sitting in their cars instead of congregating in the big waiting rooms, and then they get texted to come have their ultrasound and blood work and all other safeguards that have gone into effect in non-acute settings in healthcare obviously have made their way to IVF units. Beyond that, there hasn't been a tremendous spillover into epidemiologic concerns, what happens in the laboratory, because all of the normal patient safeguards that you would need in dealing with any infectious agent were already in place. So I don't think it has too many other aspects there. It hasn't had an enormous long-term effect, unless it's one that either we haven't recognized yet or that I personally haven't been smart enough to realize. So it's, which is always a possibility.
But you are seeing patients come in at a greater rate than if the graph normally looks about like this across the 12 months, it went like this, and then now you're seeing more come in for treatment to try and capitalize on the time they have.
Pretty much, in terms of when I talk to my ex-colleagues that still run programs, and I talk to people within the industry as we track volumes, it's as if, it's like if you're controlling a dam and the water builds up behind the dam and you close the dam, you close it up so that the water builds up for a while, then you open it up more to let the flow out. It's more of a, kind of a throughput control than anything. And that throughput control is showing up in the aggregate.
Right.
So changing gears once again, just for the end here, have you, when you think about your venture fund, do you have any sort of, geographic focus? Do you end up seeing more people from New York City? Where do you tend to source most of your deals from? And, how has that kind of changed over the last few years?
Okay. Well, I started getting business plans in the IVF world, I think after I wrote my first article about the IVF industry. It's like the next day, anybody who was tinkering in their garage sent me their business plan, which is great. And I love that. My sourcing process really came from the 5-year deep dive I did into the IVF industry. And I did sort of a formalized input-output analysis and figure, okay, we've got, using the United States as an example, we have 7 million people with infertility, and we make 70,000+ babies a year, which means our single most effective treatment is solving the problem of just a little bit over 1% of the people with the problem. So we are severely supply constrained. And it's okay, we're severely supply constrained. What are the bottlenecks that go into that supply constraint? And I came up with 18 specific bottlenecks. That number has since grown to 25. And my sourcing became, okay, I started getting all these ideas coming in. Every one of them was well thought out. Every one of them was, there was a basis of a real solution. It wasn't just, oh, somebody should think how to fix this. But what I was looking for were the most effective means to open up those 18 bottlenecks. And, one of them, example was just the complete breakdown of the cryo storage. So when I met a company that came to me and said, okay, we've got a well-designed, scalable solution to the breakdown in cryo storage. Okay, they had me at hello. So I didn't care if that idea came from, MIT, or if it came from, someone sitting on a horse in Montana, working as a rancher, who using pencil and paper while during a lull in the action, a lull in the ranching action, sketched out a means of doing this better. A good idea.
Those two stories is much more interesting for me. I would really want to hear the second story. That'd be fantastic.
So so I get ideas from all over the place. Interestingly, some of the machine learning and AI ideas I've gotten for IVF, I've gotten similar business plans from 5 different continents.
Oh, wow.
All of them with the basis of excellent technology. So some of these ideas are, it's just the basis of technology that exists and the recognition of an obvious problem. Terrific. And then we have to decide, okay, is there a business in there? But really, my vetting of it is trying to, the problems that we know exist. Anything I teach my students, I say, don't come to me with your idea. Come to me with the problem that you want to solve.
There you go.
And it really kind of focuses their attention on, okay, the first step towards success, solving a problem, not just come up with an idea that attracts me because I've got a technology in my finger, in front of me that's cool.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the way, that's really the way that kind of the path that we try to follow, because my job is to find 1 million cycles a year for the United States, find 5 million a year for China, and find another 15 to 20 million cycles a year for the world. And if we're going to do that, we just need to start, it's an engineering issue. Let's widen the throughput. Let's figure out what are the engineering bottlenecks and break them down and start letting the marketplace and that back pent up demand of 7 million people, let that filter into the marketplace and in a venture level, which nobody else really was doing.
Right. It's very similar to design principles, where if you talk to someone that is deep as a designer, they don't talk to you about how to design a product. They talk to you about how to define a problem. And once you actually define the problem, then you can actually think about designing a product. But you never start with the product. You always start with the problem, and it's very, very similar across everything else. So we have time probably for one last question, and this again is in the same line of entrepreneurship. But what do you think is kind of the most helpful program that a university can implement to promote entrepreneurship, either among their faculty or their students?
They should get rid of grades.
You could say yours, which is fine.
No, I think it's a more foundational thing. I think they should get rid of grades. The things that you need to be, to really expand everyone's feeling of being entrepreneur-ish. I don't necessarily want to create entrepreneurs insofar as someone who's going to, navigate venture capital and know how to structure a Series A round and things like that. I want people to be fearless. I want them to be problem solvers, and I want them to approach it with a sense of humility. The grading system as we use it now in universities is anti all of those. Half the grades are given arbitrarily, which means that they just, there's no rhyme or reason for defining success, which is the wrong thing you want anyone in entrepreneurship to think. We want them to be wed towards hard endpoints with measurable, reproducible outcomes. Humility, insofar as I see people get crushed if they don't get an A+. They've got their self-images are so artificially resting on these artificial grading designations, which are just, it's the wrong way to create someone who's going to be able to make their way through the marketplace interpersonally. And I want them to be fearless. And grading is like, everybody goes, okay, what do I need to do to get an A in this course? So I know that's not really the answer to the question that you specifically asked, but and let them explore other areas. Let them get new languages. If they're humanities, go into the sciences, learn engineering, learn data. If you're a data engineering person, learn how to write a paragraph, learn how to express yourself creatively. But you're not going to do that if you think you're going to be competing in class with all the future writers for the New Yorker. Get rid of, change the grading system.
Not have it be so siloed.
Exactly.
Yeah. David, this has been amazing. We are at the end of our time. You have been an amazing guest and given us some new things to think about, and maybe even the way I approach my 9th grader and getting him to work. Maybe it's a little entrepreneurial spirit there. Thank you so much for being our guest today. This was fantastic. And thank you to TriNet for sponsoring our webinar series. We hope everyone has a great day, and we look forward to welcoming you next week for our breakfast. Thanks.
All right, thanks so much, David, and thanks everybody.
Thank you. And thank you to New York Bio.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.